Stephanie.
And this is Brian.
Welcome to our podcast, The Making and the Remaking of a Codependent Mind.
So this week, like we talked about in the beginning of the last couple episodes, we wanted to do an episode where we answered some questions that we got from listeners. So first of all, thank you so much for those of you who did send in some questions. We really appreciate getting any kind of feedback from people. It's fun to interact. It's good to know that people are finding the podcast helpful. And so feedback is great for that.
So we're going to start with one question that actually you should probably read since it was kind of directed at me.
Sure. Yeah, it uses your... So here was the question. It says, was there ever a time you felt like the investment in helping Brian break through his trauma was too much for you or not healthy for you?
The most challenging probably emotion that came up, and I suspect this is not unusual, was the potential for shame. So there's the question of, do I want to stay in this relationship? Whenever I asked myself that question between you and I, the answer was always yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to be with you. I was in love with you. I felt a very strong connection to you. But then there's this nagging question, like the little devil sitting on the shoulder. Mm-hmm. Should you stay in this relationship?
Yeah, sure.
Are you a fool for staying in this relationship?
Yeah. Are you being true to yourself? Are you honoring yourself by allowing certain things or
allowing certain behaviors, tolerating certain behaviors? And, so this is that kind of the shame, the internal judgment, am I weak? Am I foolish for staying in this relationship? Am I being made a fool of? That's a very challenging feeling to grapple with. And that feeling came out of these situations where more of your behavior was being revealed, including past behavior.
Yeah, right.
That was hurtful to me. And there were moments of where I felt betrayed. And I think that's the moment where a lot of people struggle about, do I leave or do I go? What does it mean if I stay? About me.
Yeah, right.
So, for instance, I think a lot of people deal with that when there's sexual infidelity. There wasn't in our relationship, but it's interesting because a lot of people treat cheating as only meaning someone had sex with someone else.
Yeah, right. Sexual infidelity is really the pinnacle of
betrayal.
Betrayal, right?
Yeah, where there's a lot of ways that people betray each other in relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah, that can be much worse than sexual betrayal even. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when I felt betrayed, I felt this potential for shame, that I was being made a fool of, and that might happen again.
Right.
It was challenging to see how you could repair that trust when you yourself were struggling to trust yourself.
Yes, exactly. Right. I think that's a good way to put it, right? Yeah. How are you supposed to trust me when I don't trust me? Mm-hmm. And my brain is just stuck in this one particular period when we're talking about this. It was just the early period before our daily conversations, or just when they were getting started, really. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't started doing the writing yet, and everything, almost all of this knowledge was not really known yet. Really unclear. All these behaviors are coming out, and we didn't even really recognize the behaviors or know what they were. So it was kind of like, I feel like there was this period of a couple months where, or maybe longer, where things got worse before they got better.
Right.
They got more difficult, because then it's like, oh, geez, that's what was going on there? That's even worse than I thought.
And you would not be able to explain it.
Yeah, right. So that compounds it. That makes it even worse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you would be very reassuring that you love me and that you were committed, and that behavior was not reflective of what you actually felt and thought and wanted.
Right.
But you couldn't say, okay, well, what was it reflective of? And what was going on? That's
what was so difficult for me, because those things, those reassuring things I said, I believed those to my core. So it's like, yes, no, I know, but yeah. And so then when these trauma triggers are happening, which I didn't even understand or know were happening, and then when I went into freeze mode, which I didn't even understand either, like, what is this, So I'm confused. Like I'm getting triggered, a shame trigger or something, whatever, a trauma trigger. Like, say you're expressing some kind of anger, some kind of emotion that I had trouble dealing with, and it sent me back into my abuse period, as if I was being abused, and now I'm frozen, And then you're wanting something. You're wanting some kind of reassurance. You're wanting me to say something that explains a particular thing from the past or recent past, and I can't because I'm in freeze. And then the best I can do is try to get out of freeze, try to get out of the shame. So I try to say whatever I can to just get out of shame, not try to actually answer the question, or it's just like, wow, what do I need to do to stop feeling what I'm feeling right now? And then because it's obvious that that's what I'm doing, kind of. Again, but it was very messy because neither one of us knew this was happening.
And it really had to get to that point where, we had one particular, it wasn't really so much a fight, right? It was just a disruption in the force of our relationship, where I was really in a frame of mind was, I don't know how to trust this person. Yeah. And if I can't trust this person, how do I stay?
Right. I think I remember what you're talking about. Yes. And I remember there being words like, I don't know if you're capable of this, something along those lines.
And that was the kind of rubber hits the road moment for both of us. But I think particularly for you, and at that point you were like, okay, 100%, I'm doing this. I'm figuring this out.
Yeah, right.
I can't delay anymore. You had some delaying tactics. You had some tactics.
I'll just read this book.
We'll talk about it after we read this book.
Yeah, wait till I'm done with it.
You would push conversations, kick them down the road. So, but at that point you were like, no, I'm going to do this. And that's almost kind of when you started your daily work.
Right.
We looked for a therapist together, and I guess it was for me too, kind of the rubber hits the road, because before that I was certainly kind of advocating for myself and asking the questions I want to ask, but maybe not going too far. Yeah. I was always, right. Because I would see you again, I would pull back when it became clear that maybe we were in a conversation that you couldn't handle. Yeah. And at that point it was like, well, I can't do that. Like I need to,
do that indefinitely.
Right. I need the answers that I need to know if this is going to work or not. So, and it was around that time, one, you started committed to almost daily work, reflection, and then conversation. Yeah. And then also we discovered the codependency and narcissism connection.
There were these little breakthroughs like that was like, oh my God, this gave me a ton of material to work with.
Yeah. So that made your two prior romantic relationships make a whole lot more sense to both of us, which was very helpful.
Yeah, because there was still a lot of work to do as far as like, okay, well, why did I stay there beyond just
right? It had to be fleshed out.
There was other things going on there.
Yeah, it had to be fleshed out, but it was like really a map for helping us navigate those conversations. And then also, the codependency itself was helpful in that it depersonalized it a little bit for me. Yeah, so it wasn't that this was directed at me or a product of our relationship. This was a phenomenon that a lot of people found themselves stuck in, and there was a pathway out of it. And we talked about it as being kind of somewhat like alcoholism or drug addiction. So that's where we started talking about the codependent Brian and the authentic Brian, is that most of the behaviors that what I felt hurtful or had a sense of betrayal happened when your codependent habits were triggered and activated. Yeah. So almost like you were under the influence of alcohol or drugs. Yeah. You were not behaving as your authentic self.
Yeah, and it may look and feel to you as though I'm choosing this behavior over you.
Right. Sometimes it feels, I'm sure to people, family and loved ones of alcoholics or drug addicts, that they're choosing alcohol or drugs over them. But, no one in their right mind, as you would say, would choose a life of addiction or choose a life of codependency.
Yeah, you're not like really literally sitting there and going, you know what, now I'm going to choose this instead just because...
it's more important to me to be codependent than it is to be in a loving relationship.
Because I really need this behavior to survive. Right. This is all just subconscious, reflexive, habitual behaviors.
So once those things happened, the daily commitment to reflection and conversation and the increased understanding that came from our readings about codependency and narcissism and conversations, I don't really think I had moments of, should I stay in this relationship? Yeah. It was certainly still, there were some hard times and painful and uncomfortable times.
For a good period of time from there. Yeah.
But there wasn't as much of existential threat when those times came up.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, I had, at least for, this period that we're talking about where the daily work started, I had some especially difficult times those first couple of months, because as much as I felt as though I was starting to discover things and learn things, I didn't feel like I was making progress fast enough. And we'd have certain conversations where it would kind of be recurring conversations. And I was still having this thing that I did before all this work started, where I'd be like, I thought we had a good conversation about that. Like,
why are we talking about this again?
Like,
yeah.
I don't know if I can handle talking about this again. And why do I have to talk about this again? It's as though like you weren't recognizing the progress that I was making or something. I was just like making it way too personal, as far as kind of the flip side of you taking personally the codependent behaviors. I was taking personally you not recognizing that I was, even though in these moments when I look back on them, like it's perfectly valid that you were just asking for continued conversation. It's not like we have a conversation and that's it, and we're never going to talk about that thing again. Like,
yeah, and then I'm 100% reassured and 100% trust restored.
Like, there, I found the perfect explanation. We're moving on.
We're moving on. You didn't recognize that we were probably going to have many of these conversations for the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
And that trust takes a long time to be restored. And
Yeah.
a huge part of trust is consistency, right?
Yeah.
Is that we have that conversation over and over again.
Yeah.
And then
it doesn't keep changing or something.
It doesn't the story doesn't keep changing, because that's what happened a lot.
Yeah.
During those months, is that the story would keep changing.
Yeah, because it'd be like, oh, this explanation makes more sense. Because, a lot of that stuff, since I didn't have the knowledge, it's just like, what sounds right?
In the moment, right?
Yeah.
And we've talked about in other episodes. So I might hear a different story even before you start doing the work. I would hear a different story about certain situations depending on what was the path of the least shame.
Yeah, right. Or what made the end of the conversation feel most satisfying to me, or whatever, like your reaction.
Right.
Like, you seemed very happy with
contented
that.
That explanation.
Response.
Yeah, and then that was a period too where we talked about compartmentalization. You were opening all these compartments. And you yourself would sometimes be shocked as to what you had said or done in certain moments that we had no memory of. Yeah,
because, one of the things being like, I had no idea how dishonest of a person I was. I thought, in general, sometimes I, lied by accident or whatever. But then, we'd look back through a text record or something, and I go like, oh my God, no, that was a lie right there. I don't remember lying.
Right. Yeah, anything anywhere from that was a lie to like, oh yeah, I was really misrepresenting that situation. Yeah. And so this is where you struggling to trust yourself came up as well. And I think that was part of it, right? So you would tell me a story. You needed me to trust you before you could trust yourself.
Yeah, kind of.
And I needed you to trust yourself before I could trust you.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what it felt like. And that went on for a good chunk of time. So yeah, I think like you, I didn't have... after a little while passed, I didn't have so many existential feelings, but I still didn't understand my trauma triggers and stuff like that. So when you expressed disappointment, or, it triggered, that was one of my triggers.
Right.
Someone being angry or upset or distrustful or, disappointed or something. So yeah, that would send me into a trigger mode for a very long time. These conversations were very hard and a little bit existential feeling. Even if I wasn't literally thinking of it that way.
Well, since you bring up trauma trigger, let's go to the next question, which is, how do you take the power back from the other side of a trigger? How do you stand against those negative feelings?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's, trauma triggers and just triggers in general it's a great topic. We've talked about it several times throughout this series, but seeing that question made me think, spending a little more time talking about how that felt and the types of things I've done to get through those is a valuable thing, I think. Because, they're very difficult to deal with, especially when you don't know it's happening, right? And so back, rewind back again to these early days that we're talking about, not even having that language, not even knowing, first of all, not even using the word trauma. I kind of somewhat knew my past history and that bad things happened to me, but didn't understand that it was trauma and what trauma can cause.
So that was really the first step.
Yeah.
It's really recognizing your trauma.
Exactly.
And then understanding what was happened to you when that trauma was being triggered.
Yeah.
But even when you had that understanding, I'm sure it was difficult to manage. So how did you manage your way through those, especially those early times when you knew your trauma was being triggered, but nevertheless the feelings were still there?
Well, yeah. I mean, but like you said, the first step was just understanding that was happening at all and what can happen when that happens. So when it does happen, I have a little bit of a frame of reference. You know, I'm not just feeling extremely anxious and can't speak and I have no idea why. So the first thing that I do then now because these still happen, obviously, shame gets triggered because I have a lot of things from my past that I was carrying shame about. I'm not necessarily still carrying that shame, but there were lots of things that can remind me of that shame. Right. And it can feel similar.
Absolutely.
Like when, I was talking about, we were going on a walk talking about the shame episode that we did.
Shame venting.
The shame venting episode. And I was feeling a lot of shame just having those conversations. So the first thing though is just when I start to feel those feelings, which I've now identified, this kind of anxiety, I'm feeling attacked. I'm feeling like I'm under attack or something, I know that's a trigger feeling then. So first of all, I'm just acknowledging the feeling. That's the most important thing, I think, for me is just acknowledging that I'm having that feeling. Maybe I need to say something out loud, or maybe I don't. But
and sometimes you would.
I've said it
not
out
so much
loud.
anymore, but kind of. I think when you were first getting used to manage your way through those feelings, you would say, "I'm feeling triggered."
Yeah,
and just so we would take a pause.
Which I can really, in the reason why I felt as though I could do that with you is because I already kind of had this blanket. I came to learn that pretty much across the board, these triggers were false signals with us. We were a safe space. You were a safe space, just not in the way of like, oh, I can do no wrong. This relationship you can do no wrong.
You're never going to be triggered.
You're never going to say anything hurtful ever.
Yeah.
But the chances are this is a trauma trigger. And so early on when I was starting to feel those and it was really intense, I would say, oh, okay, I'm feeling triggered here. Like, let's take a pause kind of.
And I think it's important to say that it was always a pause. It was never, so we're not going to have this conversation.
Right. Yeah.
Or we're not going to be in this situation again. It was just literally a pause until you could physically and emotionally just feel a little more safe. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and I feel like 'cause part of what's has been built in with these trauma triggers for me is that it does this kind of snowball thing where, say, I'm feeling anger from you or I'm feeling disappointment from you or something. And then that compounds itself because then now if I'm in freeze and then I'm making it worse by not continuing the conversation or not. So now I feel your distrust from the fact that I can't answer this question that you asked or can't continue this conversation, or now it looks like I don't know the answer, or it's like, why don't you know the answer to this? Are you holding something back? Like,
it's almost, if you struggle against the trigger, it makes it worse.
Yeah, exactly.
If you just acknowledge that it's happening. Yeah. And just allow it to, it's kind of like physical pain, right? If you struggle against the physical pain, and often the recommendation is just acknowledge that it's happening, breathe through it.
Yeah. Yeah. So shame being the biggest one. And so we've talked about this a few times where, as part of my recovery, allowing myself to feel shame, to sit with shame and then figure out, is it legitimate? Where is it coming from? Is there something I need to do about it? Because if I couldn't just sit with it for more than 5 seconds, I'm not going to ask the right questions and I'm not going to do anything that I'm supposed to do to resolve it. Other than all I'm going to do is going to try to avoid it. So I go into freeze and then I follow with some kind of shot in the dark, dishonest comment to try to diffuse my shame and diffuse your disappointment or anger or whatever it is.
Right. You just activate your codependent behaviors.
Yeah. And
we talked about this in the healing from codependency, breaking the codependency habit, or maybe it was an early one. Just the idea that it was almost like weightlifting, right? Like you build up the capacity.
Yeah.
You get more confident in yourself so that when that comes along, you don't go into freeze mode. Yeah. You're like, okay, well, this is going to be unpleasant, but I can do it. Yeah. I can get through it.
Yeah. Yeah, because this person that asked this question gave a really good detailed story of an example of when that happened to this person. And and that's exactly how it happens with me. This is this kind of shame from the shame, or shame
Well,
from the
yeah.
trigger.
So then you're
like
feeling shame. You're feeling shame that you're triggered,
Yeah.
which is the wrong kind of shame, because
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with being hurt.
Yeah.
Or feeling weak in a moment.
Yeah.
It's so interesting the way that I think shame is so tied to feeling weak and powerless and helpless in really unhelpful ways.
Yeah.
I'm thinking just recently we were playing pickleball.
Oh, yeah.
And I did something you're not supposed to do. I ran backwards and I fell backwards and like landed on my butt and then on my back. And, you know, it was very painful. And, you know, we were surrounded by people. Everyone starts to come over. And I just felt this wave of shame.
Yeah.
So I'm in pain, right? So like people coming to help me should feel good.
Right.
But what I wanted is like, no, get away. Like, don't
turn
look
around.
at me, right? And I think I've felt that before, you know, when we trip in public or something, it's just, it's worse than embarrassment.
Yeah. Yeah, kind of.
So I think it is more like shame, like
Yeah.
being seen as weak and powerless and unable to care for yourself can be really a painful feeling to feel. So I think, you know, there can be this tendency, if you're triggered, to try to disguise or struggle against that because you're ashamed that you were triggered, right?
Yeah, that
rough.
story you told is a great example of being able to see how people handle those kind of situations. And some people obviously don't handle it very well. Like what my dad pops into my mind is when he injured himself, he would get extremely angry at himself, basically. But I could tell it was like a shame trigger. You know, he was feeling embarrassed.
Yeah, so
that
now
he cut
he's
his finger while
swearing
chopping.
and
So, yeah,
his anger
Yeah.
and is almost to deflect anyone else's.
Yeah, don't shame me. I'm gonna do
Shame,
that.
right.
You know, I'm gonna take care of the shame part of this here.
So no easy answer.
No.
And take practice as well.
Right. So as far as like taking the power back, yeah, it's really just getting through it is taking the power back, allowing yourself to feel the things and acknowledge it and move through it and resolve it the way that feels right.
And I you know, hopefully feeling proud of yourself.
Yeah.
Because these are painful emotions.
Right. That you made it through another one.
You made it through. Like you lifted the heavy weight and it's going to get easier over time. So I think the last question we have time for in this episode.
Yeah, so we may do another episode with additional questions.
We got a number of questions about resources in terms of what kind of resources would we recommend or what kind of resources did we use?
Yeah.
And
it's a tough one to answer.
It's a little bit because there wasn't actually a lot. So there is, we mentioned, I think before, or if we haven't, we should mention now, one book on trauma called The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and the Body in the Healing of Trauma.
Yeah.
I actually read this book further along. We had already read things on the web about trauma.
Yeah.
But I would certainly recommend it to anyone wherever they are in their healing journey. When I read it, it was a nice kind of confirmation actually about a lot of the things that we had discussed and discovered about your own experience.
Yeah.
And it was, you know, almost every page it was like, yep, Brian, yep, Brian, 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 which is, I think, is always helpful, seeing your experience represented in someone else's experience.
Yeah, so how it gets stored and so just good explanations of trauma triggers.
Yeah, I think it was one of the initial books to kind of kick off this really investigation of trauma, the effect that it has, the lingering effect that it has on the body and the brain and the emotional system throughout one's life. So that's one actual book that we would recommend. You read a couple of relationship books early on, but I don't think they were particularly helpful.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I was doing that during this period we were talking about earlier about where it was kind of a stalling tactic for me. Like just because of the way I did it, more or less. Like I was like, I'm going to get something out of this. But I didn't feel prepared to talk about it every night or day or anything either. It's like I wanted to read this entire book, highlight, and then maybe talk about some of my highlights or something.
And those books are really geared towards in functional relationships that had become disconnected from each other.
Yeah.
Not in relationships where there were pretty severe behavior disorders.
Yeah, right.
So for instance, your previous two relationships where there was abuse and narcissism and codependency.
Yeah, so reading books that are giving tips on healthy relationships when the whole entire relationship is kind of null and void because of these power imbalances and abuse and stuff like that. It's just like, oh, this whole thing, this first, just get out of the relationship.
Right, yeah.
Then maybe start thinking about what healthy relationships look like,
Although we did listen a lot to Together, Esther Perel's podcast, Where Should We Begin?
Yeah.
We've mentioned this podcast before. She's a relationship therapist, and the podcast is a therapy session with couples. And these are largely, quote unquote, healthy couples.
Yeah.
But I think it did help us. It gave us a lot of language to talk about our relationship.
Yeah.
In talking about the other people's relationship, it was kind of a safer way also to talk about dynamics within our relationship.
Yeah, sure.
So
we always found something to relate to in every episode.
Yeah. So that was helpful.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was particularly directly helpful to your healing, but I think it gave both of us, but especially you, some confidence in the way that you approached our relationship.
Yeah, right. Well, one thing, kind of an indirect way that it helped my situation was we would listen to it while driving, usually to camping trips, and I would get very anxious. This was before I knew about trauma triggers and stuff like that, because I knew a conversation was going to follow and it was going to be difficult. Because really, back then, every conversation that involved our relationship or just anything that wasn't just talking about benign things was difficult for me.
Right. Intimacy was difficult.
Intimacy and vulnerability. And so, but we kept doing it. And I kept saying, no, this is good. Like I knew it was good somehow. Like I needed to be doing this. And it was helpful. And every time we finished one of those conversations, it was like, okay, yes.
Yeah. And you felt that, after you felt that high after a good workout where you're like, oh, I did it. I got it through and I produced something. I think probably both of us agree, though, that the biggest resource really has been your story.
Yeah, right. Well, in our conversations, so the first thing that pops in my head when I hear this question is human interaction. That's the biggest resource,
Right.
Because it's fine to go, okay, there's some good books out there, read these books, but I wasn't going to heal on my own because my brain was where the damage was, so I'm not going to just sit there by myself and figure this out really necessarily.
The combination of you writing, which gave us a lot of material to talk about. So, you would write about a certain part of your life, your childhood, the relationship with G, or, subsequent friendships, your relationship with R and J. You would do a passage of writing, and then we would talk about that.
Yeah.
There was a lot of material there for the conversation. We just didn't sit down and okay, what are we going to talk about tonight? Like you had done this reflection. Right. And then you would talk about, what your understanding was, and I would ask questions and maybe challenge some stuff, or maybe add some insights into comparing it to my past or other relationships I've had. So your commitment to really going into your past and trying to document it and rewrite it in a more way, and your generosity in sharing that with me, I think were really key to moving forward.
It gave me a lot of confidence and momentum also, because I remember in the earliest days, you brought up every relationship conversation.
Yeah.
I didn't bring up any, and I actively tried to avoid some topics. And now that use the word reflection, that's what I called it back then, reflection hour, because I did it at the very end of my work day before we had our cocktail hour. I'd be writing for an hour, and then we get together, and then I would start the conversations and based on what I was writing about. And that felt really good, and that felt good for both of us, I think. It's like, okay, I'm fine. Like I can do this. I can talk about these things.
Yeah, you can be a partner in this in this relationship.
And then the amount of conversations that we had gave us more momentum too. Just like, wow, we're figuring this out. Because I was thinking, like, I can't imagine only doing this like once a week or something like that. And it just would take
it's hard. That's what's available to a lot of people in terms of therapy. But that's better than just trying to figure it out on your own.
Right.
We should probably mention CODA.
Sure. Codependence Anonymous. Yeah.
Because a lot of people go there.
Yeah. As far as a resource,
You went there once.
I went there once. Yeah. I probably would have gone more if it was closer. I think it was like 45 minutes or an hour to drive to.
And when was this again? Like what?
This was way back. This was actually in between the R and J relationships. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's when I tried that, because I was going to this kind of group therapy thing, and the topic of codependency came up one night. So it was this kind of group therapy thing where it was just like they started with a topic, and then the whole session was discussing this topic, and codependency came up. And I had heard this term before. That friend that I talked about, where it was a good friendship, but we were both disordered, that word came up. But it was complete lack of understanding. We were misusing the word. And so I just let it go because it didn't make any sense. And the same thing happened really during this group therapy thing, because the way it was explained didn't resonate with me.
Right.
I didn't understand myself enough for it to really connect. But when I went to the meetings, because we talked about how I went to AA meetings also, I really didn't like the format. I didn't like the steps necessarily. Like, I understand the appeal of having like steps, like, oh, just do these things and then this will happen.
You'll be healed.
But this kind of one size fits all thing is tricky. So that's why I think I like the format of our podcast where we're just talking about experiences, as opposed to like, do this, then this will probably help you.
But you did say, which is kind of funny, that you like the people at the Coda meeting more than you like the people at the AA meeting. So
I had no idea why at the time.
Right.
But because codependent people are agreeable.
They're nicer people. And you in reflection, you were speculating, obviously, that a lot of the AA people seem to have lots of narcissistic traits.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and, again, of course, I didn't understand narcissism at the time, but yeah, looking back and thinking about a lot of people that I was in contact, or were the people that were most vocal in those meetings, and those are the only people you heard. So I think a lot of people probably got turned off from the program because they'd go to a meeting and go, oh my God, these 10 assholes are the only ones talking. And it's like, well, how am I going to heal when these people are clearly messed up,
And in the Coda meeting, everyone was like, oh, no, you go. No, you go.
Yeah, right, exactly. The thing that I think is great, like I said, is the human connection. Right. So I think that's what makes all of these things really work, is getting together with a group of people and talking about things. And
we've talked about how kind of terrible, almost tragic it is that when your trauma happens within interpersonal relationships, when that's the source of the damage and the hurt, it makes it even more difficult to be with people, because other people are a source of fear and shame.
Yeah, it's this kind of self-perpetuating problem.
So it does seem like Coda meetings might be a place where you can meet safe people.
Yeah.
And start to feel safe again.
Yeah, except the hope is that there are some people in there that have actually come out the other side and going to help people at that point. And it's not just a bunch of people that are recognizing they're codependent but not knowing what to do about it, and then just hoping that these steps are going to somehow help them. Because the steps I don't love. I mean, I really don't. For me personally, powerlessness was like one of my biggest problems. And step one of all these programs is I am powerless. And I would need to give my power over to some other thing that's more powerful, whatever that is, God, other people, whatever it is. But that's the last thing I needed to do.
Absolutely.
I already did that.
You did. You
my
gave
whole
it
life,
over
I'm
to
giving
narcissists.
all of my power over to everyone else around me. And that was not helping me. It was not serving me. So a program where step one is give away all your power, like that's
admit that you're powerless. I know.
Admit, no, yeah, sure, I'm powerless. Yeah, great. Powerless over everything in my entire life. Yeah. I think parts of me felt that when I went to those meetings, but didn't have this language or whatever. So, but I definitely did enjoy when I connected with people. I mean, that's the main thing, is to connect with people. I think the biggest resource. Just make sure those are the right people. Make sure that these are good people that you can offer something to, and they can offer you.
That deserve you. That deserve your trust. That deserve your time. That deserve your attention. I think that's all we have time for today, as they say.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll do this again in the future, if this turned out to be a valuable episode framework. So let us know. And also, as we've said, we really appreciate follows and likes and reviews on the podcast platforms. That's helpful for us and for other people to find the podcast. You'll hear from us again in a couple of weeks.